see a few points, a few questions. Shira, why do you call them modernist architects? I don't necessarily disagree with you, but I'd be very curious to know how you're using modernism here, or how they did. Because since the morning we thought that modernism was the problem, and here you suggest perhaps not. Which actually leads me to Don's basic point, which you kind of turn on its head or freeze list of the usual suspects by using your cost-benefit analysis of renewable energy to show us that, in fact, global capitalism might be the logic that, in fact, saves us as far as the despotic source of that redemption. Central planning is always, which came up in your remarks as well, and in Walter Gropius's worldview as well. Without central planning, nothing good will ever get done. Which leads me back to Shira. I was thinking about Sylvia Crow's comments about reconstruct, or what you observed about her efforts, involvement in the reconstruction of post-war Britain. And I was led to think about the reconstruction of post-war Europe more generally, and as almost something of a laboratory for what we're talking about. And to the point where I even was reminded of Morgenthal's plan to deprive Germany of its industrial infrastructure, which of course the Soviets did anyway, which Roosevelt decided not to do. And I was wondering what was, if you can go back to the archives, Morgenthau was Secretary of Agriculture, if I'm not mistaken, what plans, what blueprints had been drawn up for a post-industrial or a deindustrialized Germany, at least in the American zone. Curious. And then in terms of thinking about the devastation in Europe in 1945, I was thinking about the current reconstruction efforts going on in American, these kind of post-industrial wastelands of American Rust Belt cities, as recently in Cleveland. I'm speechless. And I hear that that's not the worst. So, yeah.
I'm a Clevelander, so be careful.
Oh, okay.
And
we'll
it is.
Talk later.
So, do you want to pick a few questions?
No, we can take them one at a time.
So I'll start. So thank you very much for your question. So yeah, modernism, that's a huge topic. And I come from the field of architectural history, and there is a tendency, let's say a trend in our field to expand the notion of modernism to modernisms, plural. And that is to look beyond exactly the Siam, the kind of fixed Corbusier, Gropius, and all the great heroes of the heroic modernism that we're used to think about when we think about modernism, and to open it up to other kinds of modernisms, both in terms of style and design. So we have all these like local variants, like in Mediterranean modernism, or like in Levant modernism, or South American modernism, but also in terms of more profound underpinnings. And why I use them, why I call them modernists, because they viewed themselves as modernists. Their way wasn't the machine age. Their way was a different way. And they were basically technocrats and the high modernist ideology of state, of the connection between the all-knowing expert and the state, etc. So they had all the ideological underpinnings, but they had a different interpretation, both in terms of design or in terms of their orientation, spatial orientation. One of the major points I want to make in this regard is that they focused on policy and planning as opposed to design. That is, by contrast to what we think about, so Gropius and other people in the functionalist city, etc., the focus is on the design, on the architectural object and its relations to the immediate environment, space, style, etc., etc. But here they were branching out and expanding the notion to larger geographical scales and to the idea of policy, spatial policy. how to organize key human land uses within a given area. So this is basically the idea, this whole umbrella of modernisms of mid-20th century in which they fit in. And then regarding the second, it's a great question on Germany. I don't know, I can't tell you much. I can only tell you that in their regard, the Dutch certainly was a pioneering, the Dutch experience, and that was like the most intense laboratory from their perspective, but it's a great thing that it's a great question and I have to check it out as well.
I said that this paper is presented with a sense of urgency, but it also comes from a sense of desperation. A desperation at the current attempt over the last 25 years of the UNFCCC, which has been our best bet. Capitalism is undoubtedly an unfolding disaster, and it is exacerbated when it comes to the oil and gas industry by the regime of subsidies, which in many ways corrupts the basic logic of pure capitalism as a theoretical option, and of course perpetuates the kind of imbalances that have produced the climate crisis. However, looking at the world pragmatically, and I made the disclaimer that this is also a pragmatic perspective, I don't think we have the time to wait until capitalism somehow corrects itself or rids itself from the regimes of subsidies that are perpetuating it in many realms. And therefore, in desperation, I am looking to the perpetrators, in many ways, to reinvent themselves as something new without demanding that they completely reject or become something else than what they are. So yes, I can see the ideological challenge that is presented by this line of thought for many of us, especially if we've been busy for the last decades in a critique of capitalism, and then we're looking for the basic logic of capitalism to redeem us. I think if we had 50 years in hand, maybe we wouldn't have been pushed to this kind of logic. But I think every month or every year that goes by without radical change being implemented somehow makes our chances of survival even slimmer. So hence I'm prepared to work within capitalism with all the emotional cost that it exacts from me.
I think both of you are presenting some kind of naive attitude. I think you said that this is hopeful thinking. So Shira said something. The way to fix the problem is maybe find a technological way by designing, and maybe Dan said something about that the perpetrators that own the people that have millions of dollars in the ground will somehow maybe decide to give up the money and maybe go other way and start building solar plants. So hopefully if the world was perfect, it might be like that. But maybe I can read something that Wilkof, American environmental lawyer and architect, he wrote, or he was in a lot of UN committees, and he said something like, I used to think the top environmental program were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address this problem, but I was wrong. the top environmental program are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with this, we need spiritual and cultural transformation. So maybe looking at some technical, we had the chance 30 years to find a technical solution and stuff, and maybe the solution is, okay, we can talk about in the last session, something like cultural change, not technical.
So let me begin by saying we can tackle the naivete accusation in two different ways. Both of them, again, are practical and pragmatic. If hardcore Republicans in 1987 would have made the argument that the Soviet Empire is about to dislodge itself and dismantle itself because of a variety of internal processes that are going in within the Soviet bloc, other Republicans in the room would have accused them of dangerous naivete and would made the sort of the Reaganist argument that nothing would stop the Soviet Union from its ambitions to dominate the world, and we mustn't be allowed to even to think in these directions. So that's one challenge that I put to you. The other is, if you were the economic advisor for the GCC6, and you would be thinking about how they could prepare themselves to post-oil. The post-oil, which 25 years ago seemed to be the period after the oil runs out, but now we realize that there is enough oil, especially in these areas where oil is the most available and most easily extractable than anywhere else in the world. So post-oil now is not really about oil running out, but oil losing value. So if you were to advise these people about how they should prepare to a reality which could be there and get the better of them any day now, you saw the numbers, what would you offer them? Which would not be naive and which would be workable and attractive to them.
I'm looking at what happened today in Israel. So today in Israel, in future contract, solar systems are today cheaper than gas. Okay, and where does the government put the money? Okay, $1 billion in gas and almost nothing in solar.
Absolutely.
So reason is not playing it here. Okay, this is not. Maybe it's reasonable people sitting and said, okay, what will be best for our people? They are sitting and maybe thinking what will be best for specific companies that rule the world today. So,
I agree. The main difference is that the future of gas power stations in Israel probably represents 0.5% of GDP. And when the GCC6 are looking at post-oil, they're looking at 95% of their economies. So the kind of innovative and sometimes daring decisions that they will need to take are different from the petty cash that is being distributed amongst interested parties, and I'm completely with you about the analysis of what happens in Israel, because it's a marginal element of the economy. When it's the whole house, I think that sort of outlandish and imaginative and speculative possibilities along the lines of the Soviet Union reinventing itself as Russia should at least be entertained.
You talk practically. Do you know if there is any real attempt, for example, to convince the GC to do this kind of transformation? I mean, did you ever try to, I don't know, communicate someone there if there are any active agents for such transition? It sounds actually like a very interesting, as you say, a very different agenda than the usual agenda of public opinion in the West, in the developed world.
Many people ask me this. I almost missed today's conference. I didn't even have worry about it, because there is an event going on yesterday and today and tomorrow in Abu Dhabi, which I was supposed to be at and present these ideas. It didn't work out in the end. These are new ideas that I've been playing with. So the answer is yes, many think that this is what should happen, and I'm not loath to the idea. I would, however, say that I don't really think that fundamentally the GCC leaders need someone like me or somebody from the outside to show them the blueprint of what their future might look like. I think that to me, and I know it because I see the literature and I talk to the people and I know what they're preoccupied with. They produce post-oil economic blueprints on a yearly basis now, and they are becoming more and more ambitious as the years go by, and all of them have alternative energy as #1 item. Not to the extent that I'm talking about, of voluntarily closing their own taps on oil production. So yes, I think that this exchange should happen, but no, I don't think that they really need somebody from the outside to say. Nevertheless, I hope that they will be reading my next book.
Who is the owner of this?
Dotan? Let's, Dotan.
Thank you very much. It's been very interesting. Shira, it seems to me that if there's one branch within the historical discipline which is not shying away or maybe obsessed about counterfactual or speculative histories, is architectural history, and because it's huge interest in plans basically and planners. So I wonder whether you feel at home in this speculative. And also to just informative questions, why Crete and why OECD? And it seems to me that within this usual suspects of post-war, so UNESCO, IMF, World Bank, OECD seems to be the one that is that is still somehow clear. Or maybe should I say clean in terms of its intervention in world development, economy, and so on, and it seems to be the kind of ultimate good guy. And I wonder if this is the case. And for Dani, can you complete this blueprint with the chapter about sovereignty of these countries? Popular sovereignty for one sense, and also about, as you said, what makes these states, which is external protection, but this can be replaced with the current.
Okay. So so thank you, Dotan. I'm working on it in terms of feeling comfortable. I'm as an historian, I can talk about what they thought, but I'm still working on me and trying to experiment myself with counterfactual and kind of like futuristic histories. But when you, as a typical historian, if you want, I feel much more comfortable talking about what they thought, what they envisioned, and how their dreams fell through. About the OECD, so basically after the very quick recovery, of course OECD was established as part of the Marshall Plan to help Europe's recovery, and after the quick recovery of Europe, they soon started to become an actor within the global aid market. So as early as 1961, they already started aiding both countries in the global south, as well as their less, I would say, poorer or backwards members of Europe. And in this case, both Turkey and Greece were actually the experimental kind of field that they were playing with. And Crete specifically was chosen because it was especially backward, and they had this whole thing about world decline, et cetera, so for various reasons it was selected as a project of the OECD, but yeah, they were part of the global aid market since 1961, basically.
The question about sovereignty, and I think this is what also the gentleman here near the table was going to ask about, who owns the oil. Great question. I'm using the GCC 6. I'm using an abstraction when I treat them as independent sovereign countries. They are not. They are formally, and therefore the ownership is theirs, and of course is contracted out to oil companies, mainly American oil companies, for a royalty in a binding legal manner. But if push comes to shove and they decide to do something radical with their oil, like keeping in the ground for the next 50 years, I think that the immediate question is what would the political connections between their partners, the oil multinationals, and the U.S. regime be at the time? And to what extent would the U.S. and maybe one or two other dominant countries in the West allow this to happen without completely annihilating their sovereignty by physically invading, as was the case in Iraq, or something else. So yes, I am aware that in the interest of brevity and clarity, I'm treating them as free agents, which they are not, and this has to go into the operational model that might facilitate this in 5 or 10 or 15 years as a huge factor in it and a huge element in it.
One question is to Shira. Thank you for your presentation. That was very interesting. But just to speculate together, I have a question. So what you presented us was more kind of a top-down city planning. So what if, for example, the local knowledge, local peoples, local know-how were incorporated to those projects more? I don't know, maybe they were, but I have a feeling that there was an emphasis or concern to preserve nature or to create a self-contained, self-sustaining city planning, but still the locals are kind of missing that, which might be what went wrong maybe.
It's a great question. And actually, I just omitted for terms of brevity and clarity. There's a whole part. So I'll say two things. The quick answer is that there was a whole part of local participation, and that was also part of this 1960s trend, of participatory planning, etc. Glickson himself had engaged local teams of planners and local teams of multidisciplinary teams, not only planners. And there was also a major component in the plan that allowed for flexibility. It was a 25-year plan, and they had this thing that every few years, according to the plan, they had to check in with the local community, what's going on. So they had a lot of that going on. Certainly it was it fell within these kind of innovative ideas in the 1960s. But I would actually take it to a deeper level, that in planning there was always this authoritative component. Even, it's like like the despot, you can include the residents as much as you like, but in the end of the day there's an expert and there's an authority of the expert. So there's always this interplay, basically, yeah.
Enough time for one more question? There is such a thing?
Thank you both. This was really great. I have a question for Shira. I wondered, so your main protagonist, Paris, surprisingly, but then I wonder if you know anything about the rest of the actors of this story. So we have those now, what you said about local participants in these projects, but the rest of the people, the group that was environmental components, were they then swallowed by high modernist projects, or did they continue their untaken paths elsewhere?
So I'm exploring it. I can tell you one thing, for instance, that now I'm looking into, which is a plan that they had for a bird sanctuary, another model plan as a team. Because as you noticed, I didn't even mention any collective endeavor. It was only kind of like singular, kind of like individualistic experiments. And that's because I'm looking into these. So one thing that I just got the archival records from Australia, they were sent to me, is a bird sanctuary near Calcutta as a joint project. So that would be one direction, but I'm still working on it. I have to see how it will unfold.
So I think that if the previous round or the previous discussion put on our table the question of within or without capitalism, and also the prognostic and diagnostic elements and the tension between them, both our speakers add to this dish, on the one hand, the horizon of global governance with UNESCO and perhaps the horizon of technocracy as one possibility of engaging climate catastrophe, contrasted by the kind of Pax Americana and the non-liberal aspects thereof, which I think is another overarching tension that frames the entire discussion. So please join me in thanking Dani and Shira.